Excellent. So welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about machine readable governance, but before we do that, let's just quickly discuss that this meeting is conducted under the Linux Foundation Public Health, antitrust rules and regulations, and if you need a reference for that, certainly we can send that link around. The other thing is that there's a code of conduct, which is basically to be nice and be inclusive. Everybody is welcome to participate and have a voice at this table. So just keep that in mind as we proceed. Is there anybody that would like to introduce themselves that hasn't been here before? I think I see a lot of familiar faces today. Okay. All right. Well, then with that said, we're going to get started. Mike and James are going to jump into machine readable governance. If there's any issues, you can reach out to Ken or I as co-chairs of this meeting if anything comes up throughout the meeting. But otherwise, Mike and James, I hand it over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Let's talk about machine readable governance. All right, so just as a brief preface, this work is heavily inspired by the RFC 430 by Daniel Hardman and collaborators. The link is included here at the top of this document, so you can read a very thorough discussion of governance and how it might work with machines if you'd like. But as a brief introduction to what we're presenting today, what is machine readable governance? A governance framework, also called a trust framework, is a set of rules that establish trust about processes and indirectly about outcomes in a given context. So that's what a governance framework in general is. And so machine readable governance is governance frameworks embodied in formal data structures, so it's possible to react to them with software, not just with human intelligence. So the idea here is to have the machines help us as we seek to build an ecosystem of issuers and moderators and verifiers and holders who can all collaborate together to make excellent things happen with health data and personal data and privacy and easy, powerful capabilities. What are the benefits of machine readable governance? Trust frameworks are like guy wires. They balance opposing forces to produce careful alignment and optimal behavior. So with machine readable governance, we're looking to increase the trust between the various actors and parties in the ecosystem. We need verifiers to be able to trust that issuers are legitimate. We need holders to be able to feel, to be able to control their data and to share it knowing that it will be adequately protected and used properly and with consent and so on. It helps to organize the ecosystem by codifying the rules, conventions, standards, schemas, etc., that are going to be used. That helps to improve things like interoperability and efficiency, and to prevent disagreements or incompatibilities from becoming a problem. And the other thing that we're discovering with machine readable governance, at least from a programmer standpoint, is that it helps a lot with flexibility. It allows our agents to accommodate change without having to frequently re-release or update our agents. We can do things like add issuers or verifiers or schemas to the ecosystem without causing as many waves and problems as sometimes might happen if you had things hard coded in your application and you decided to say, we need to switch which issuer is allowed to issue these credentials, or the list of approved verifiers has changed. If it's in a governance file, all of the agents will adapt automatically, but if it's not, then you would have to re-release your software. All right, so at Indicio, we're working on our first production release of a governance file and how it will be used by our agents. And we're excited to utilize what we've learned in that experience to get governance up and going, machine readable governance anyway, up and going for Cardea. So we're going to talk a little bit about that sample email implementation and how it works, and then what can directly translate to a good foundation for governance for Cardea. So the goals of our email implementation of machine readable governance are, we want people to know who the governing body for the credential is, so we're sharing that contact information. We're listing the schemas that will be in use. We're listing the roles of the participating parties. We're listing the approved issuers. In this particular project, it's starting with just one. And we're going to list validated verifiers. So verifiers that are have been shown to be good actors in this ecosystem and who are going to follow their duties to help preserve people's email privacy and, you know, prevent things like spam and leakage of those emails.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
Although there might be a list of validated verifiers or verifiers who have agreed to participate within the rules, nothing prevents a holder from presenting their credentials to a verifier not on their list. Is that correct?
That's correct. Ad hoc connections are still possible. It's not like saying this is the only set of verifiers that are allowed. It's more like saying we've done some due diligence to say that these ones are safe for sure, but you are welcome to use your data as you see fit. And you can connect to other verifiers, you know, that aren't on this list. Good point.
It helps to give a additional trust and assurance to the end user of where and how their data is being utilized, because that verifier is conforming to the rules of the governance framework. Just add additional thoughts there.
And so kind of on that point, though, is there a declarative statement about the governance framework that enables just that, right? Where a user would know, a holder would know that they have the ability to choose someone or select a verifier not on the list.
It's not really a statement there because it's inherent to the design of governance frameworks themselves, right? There's nothing about the governance framework that removes the option for users to do that, and that's on purpose. So yeah, you nod. Hopefully you're happy with that answer.
Well, maybe
yeah,
I would
Go ahead,
flip
Jill.
the question around, which is how does the holder know who's on the verified list as they're going about their interactions?
So to answer both of those questions, it does depend on the programmer of the holder application a little bit. For example, if someone who's programming a holder application says, we're going to fetch the list of approved verifiers and display that in the application and not bother to show any other method of connection to other verifiers, that would kind of shut down the ad hoc channel. Conversely, if a holder application codes things so that it's built to connect to any verifier and doesn't do anything to surface what the list of vetted verifiers looks like, then the user may never be aware of what those options look like. One of the built-in notions of a governance framework and system like this is that as it becomes more advanced, you can actually include ways to publicly display feedback or scores about particular actors of the ecosystem. And you could look things up and find out that a particular holder is not very friendly to ad hoc connections, or a different holder is not doing a good enough job of helping users understand their options about what's been vetted and trusted and where they have to be careful. So it does just depend on the holder to some degree, but all of that, with careful programming, both of those goals can be met. Okay.
There is an interesting thought there that I don't think we've explored, but potentially codifying what that ad hoc could look like, so that it is intentionally a part of the governance framework, so that it does not get removed as a capability. That's something to potentially explore further.
Or maybe on the holder's app, you'd want to present a warning to say like, hey, we don't know this person. Are you sure you want to share your data with them?
Yeah, that's the key there, is finding the way to notify your credential holder, you know, what framework they're acting in each case, you know, without muddying the waters for them. So that's the elegance of it, if you can do it right.
But I think the thought there that I have was that, and I 100% agree. I think the thought is that that ends up being specifically to the end developer to implement within the holder app. And if you can codify it as, hey, you should display a warning if this is not one of the listed verifiers in the governance framework, that could be a mechanism that could be useful.
Right.
So the ARIES RFC for machine readable governance does include some sample user interfaces that you know, they don't have to be structured visually this way, but gives some ideas of what kind of things the user interface can surface. So for example, here's a warning about an unvetted verifier to say, hey, you know, just in case you were, you know, wanting to be careful, this one's not on the list, but you could proceed anyway. Just, you know, buyer beware with this particular case. So there are some examples of that in the RFC. Hopefully that will, you know, provide guidance to the developers who are working on creating something like this. So for the validated email workflow, the steps to using the framework at its, you know, basic earliest implementation look something like this. The holder would load the governance file from a trusted party. In this case, we're relying on a domain name and a server known to be controlled by the governing body. There are additional security measures that can be implemented there so that the holder knows for sure they've got a governance file from someone they trust. Then the holder application can look through the list of issuers for validated emails and pick one to ask for their email to be validated and to receive a credential from. The holder can then use the information that's contained in the machine readable governance framework to connect to that holder. That could be like a URL or an invitation, you know, an invitation URL. And then follow the procedures for receiving a credential. In this case, it's send the email to the system, which interacts with an API to send a confirmation email with a link. They click the link. The API recognizes that they clicked the link, which demonstrates control of that email address. And then after demonstrating control of the email address, the API notifies the agent that it's okay to issue this party a credential. So the issuer uses those. That's step number 4, is to use the provided information and then issue the credential according to the governance framework. Once the holder receives the email credential and accepts it, the holder application can look up a list of verifiers that have been vetted as trustworthy so that they can go and prove to people that they control a particular email address and know that the receiving party will use their email in accordance with good, you know, policies for managing email. We're also standing up a tests verifier for this client so that the people who receive their email credential, if they choose, can immediately go and use this test verifier to prove that their credential is working properly. It's basically a thumbs up, thumbs down tool that says, yep, it worked. Everything's in good work, you know, good shape. We've included a genericized version of this governance file here. So some of the fields are a little less detailed than they would be in real life because you can't include, we didn't want to include the client's proprietary information in it. But you can see some of the things here that, you know, a lot of the fields are pretty self-explanatory. You know, the name of the governance file says this is about email validation. Version number, a brief description, it includes a last updated date. And there's usually a URL for where the documentation can be found and where some of the data resides. The schema name or ID would be listed here so that you could go to the ledger and look it up. And so that all the agents, you know, the machine agents interacting with this governance framework could know which schema they're going to be using. The roles of the parties that participate are included. So this is a pretty simple ecosystem. The only roles are issuer and verifier. And here we define a sample issuer. This could be, you know, a generic one like email issuer, or for email, it could be like, this is the Google email issuer, and this one's the Yahoo one. You provide the DID of this agent, and then there's a description of some things about it. There's a label that'll show up as a suggested name for the organization in your holder. There's a sublabel that could provide additional details. There's a website for this particular issuer. There's an email address that you could use to contact the person who manages this issuer if you needed to communicate with them before interacting with the issuer. And in this particular case, there's an available API for the requesting an invitation and requesting that an email credential be issued. This is for parts of the system that are not in the issuer or in the holder in particular. It's related to the API workflow.
Hey, Mike,
then,
can you just
yes.
zoom in a little as you go
I'm
through
sorry,
that?
that's a
That's
really
okay.
good idea. Especially when
Excellent,
looking at
thanks.
code.
Yes, thanks.
All right, so I'll pause briefly here so people can kind of soak it in for a second.
So Mike, are you actually using the email verification inside of Cardea?
So the steps to identify, to work with people's identities have not been fully fleshed out inside of Cardea. And so what we're looking to do with Cardea is we're going to try and establish a machine readable governance file that would allow the agents that we currently have to be more flexible as far as adding issuers or verifiers or changing invitation URLs or things like that. Basically, governance that would allow the existing features to function properly. And then as soon as that base level of governance is in place, we could look at adding additional governance such as email or identity verification rules that the Cardea ecosystem can use so that people can prove who they are.
That will probably be a meeting in our future on that topic alone.
Yes, identity is a big one that we have to address rather soon.
Are there any thoughts on like governance framework discovery? For example, in the beginning, you talked about someone will have to know the issuer's like endpoint to download this governance framework. Is it possible to include a governance framework within a credential issuance request, or what are some ways in which we can do better discovery for these governance frameworks?
That's a good question. Like you said, one idea is that various parties in the ecosystem, websites, issuers, etc., would notify a holder that connects to them, hey, we're using this governance framework, and you know, you can find out more about this governance framework, what rules it follows, who the other parties are, which schemas are in play by following this link. Or this is your first time connecting to an agent from, that's using this particular governance framework. Would you like to know more about the framework and see a list of parties? Are you going to accept that you're in this ecosystem that plays by these rules? That's similar to this first screenshot on the RFC, where it says, are we going to use these trust rules? It's the German University System 1.0 rules. Use these rules, more info.
We'll have a little bit more discussion on that when Lucy's turn comes in a few minutes.
Excellent. So the information for the verifier is very similar to the issuer, but just, with verifier words and contact info. And then at the bottom, it says when the name is set to email issuer, they are thus an issuer. So if this were the Gmail issuer or whatever major email provider that says yes, this is a verified email, then it's described to the ecosystem that they're an issuer. And same thing with email verifiers. You could say we're using the emails as the basis for a customer account. So gap.com is a verifier. So that's the rules. Look at these definitions and then tell the machines what to expect from the definitions and how to behave with them.
Our rules are a little light there on that implementation.
Very light.
There's a lot more that we can do here, but we kind of wanted to get started with get the ball moving. So there's a lot more we can do to describe the interactions and the things that codify the rules with this framework.
Yes, exactly. So we mentioned this a little bit about Cardea governance. So like we said, the immediate goals are to stand up just enough governance that it can be included in Cardea and provide a foundation to build on. So we need to create a governance file that includes the existing schemas and roles, invitations to the agents that are presently in use, some details about the network, and some mediator info. And we need to host the governance file. We're initially going to put it as part of the code for the government agent, because a government agent for Cardea would typically represent the governing body that's overseeing the ecosystem. And then we would adjust our agents to use that governance file. This is particularly important for the Cardea holder to have a governance file so that it can be flexibly adjusted instead of having to release new versions every time something changes. And then once this is working, we can include the machine readable governance code in the appropriate repositories. And one goal that we need to have soon is to get a publicly usable demo of the Cardea ecosystem up, including that governance, so that everyone can go look at it and interact with it and see what it does. Here's my, sorry, what?
One other comment or question. This describes what one government might do. So there might be, in the case of multiple governments, which there are a lot of, there might be multiple of these governance files. Is that correct?
Yes, we had I sometimes forget, this is my second time through the presentation to a new audience, what's been discussed and what hasn't. We talked at the last meeting I presented this at about layered governance files. So you can have multiple governing bodies that exist in their own little bubbles, but the underlying technology allows parties to move from one to the other. And if the same schemas are in play and the same standards are being used, that can be a relatively seamless transition. You could even do something with precedence of governance files to say legally local laws override the state laws, which override the federal laws, or that same pyramid in reverse. the local laws are overridden by the state laws, which are overridden by federal laws, and each one has a governance layer. Those things can happen, and the agents could be coded to understand, in this particular case, I apply this governance framework, and this other particular case, this one applies. But yeah, you're right. Various governments can have their own, or governing bodies could have their own governance.
Mike, just a quick question. Step number 5, create a public demo of Cardea. Do you have any concept of when that might occur? Because that seems like it would be a super helpful thing to get people more interested, more involved in this whole process.
So the first step that we have to take before we get to a public demo, I believe, is we probably ought to finish open sourcing the software. We're in the process of copying things over, stripping proprietary references, adjusting licenses. I can't speak for all of the pieces involved. I can speak to the enterprise agents. We have the lab software is up, and the government code is about halfway there. It only needs a few more days before that'll be publicly available. And once we have the code publicly available, then we can work with the IT guys to say, let's stand up a server and install everything there so that people can use it. So we're looking at weeks and not months. I would hope that as little as 2 weeks, I guess, is probably a fair estimate.
Thanks. Very helpful. Thank you.
I guess, and like I said, that's for the enterprise. I suppose that I should let James have a say if he, needs to say something about the mobile agents, if that timeline is dramatically different.
Yeah, he might have been kicking you under the virtual table on the 2-week quote.
Yeah, he's like, my eyes got really big, Mike. Don't do that to me.
The official notes, I wrote weeks, not months, just so everybody knows.
Those are good official notes.
And no, I think you tackled that appropriately, Mike. I think the mobile is not far behind on the enterprise side as well. So,
okay.
I have a question about the mobile app for Cardea. I'm assuming that then there is going to be some work on how to download a governance framework file onto the holder application that will be done with the mobile team for Cardea.
yes. Yep. The intention there would be to include this at the Aries framework JavaScript level so that this can be done from a framework perspective. That would be the approach that I've initially thought for that.
And could I get the contact info for the person that's just speaking? So I'm part of Global ID. We have our own holder app, and we would love to work alongside you guys. So we make sure that we also have this functionality to download the governance framework, and we're upgrading our frameworks in tandem.
Awesome. Yeah, I will put that contact information in the chat for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's James Ebert over mobile. Enterprise questions go to me, Mike Ebert. And I'll put my contact info as well. All right, so this sample file is just basically adopted directly from the email governance file with the addition of, in this sample file, we have a government organization and a lab issuer. The government is a special agent because it does do issuance, but it also has a verification role in the case of Cardea, where we have some layered credentials where it takes a test result or later on a vaccine or some other kind of health record before receiving the trusted traveler. So the government has to be a verifier, and then after that, an issuer. We need to add the list of schemas, the mediator information. A few more things to add here. This document we can make this a living document and update this as we move forward with the governance framework here.
Just a question about the rules syntax and then the actual logic processing. So they're using just JavaScript. What are you leveraging to actually for the logic and the syntax processing?
So this file is just JSON, and then you could do some fancy things with the rules. James, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I just wanted to reference the RFC to make sure I was speaking what we base this off of. This is using JSON LD specifically, just to give more context.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think
I don't see any of the fun rules in there that describe what type of credential and how old it needs to be, like for a PCR test. Are those rules coming as well? Not included in the samples so far?
Those are excellent rules that do need to be included. They're not in the set of governance that is needed to make the existing ecosystem, like the agents, just to, you know, be updatable, or to not have to update the agents in order to update the list of issuers or verifiers. But those would be some of the first rules that we could add on later, is to say, let's add the rules about how old the tests need to be before they're invalid for a negative test, or how old they need to be before they are valid for a positive test, or you know, things about like how many doses of a vaccine do you need if it's this one, or things like that. So yeah, that does need to be added. That would be early on the roadmap of things after the initial batch that says we have a governance file that defines issuers and verifiers. Verified trusted issuers, verified trusted verifiers, describe present. Yeah, it's right here. It's describe presentations between agents.
We have a question in the chat from Steve. How do you envision this working with trust registries? Great question, Steve, because I was going to bring that up also. Mike, you want to tackle that? The concept of trust registries?
I'm going to hit that a little bit later too.
Oh, excellent, Sam. Okay, so hold your thoughts, Stephen. We'll get to that a little later.
Yeah, I think Sam's the right one to address that. I'm sitting here scratching my head thinking, I don't know enough about trust registries.
Okay, no problem. We'll come back to that then. Go ahead.
Okay. We've included some future governance possibilities, things that a governance framework enables. And it's probably not the appropriate time to dive into a conversation about which are the priorities for Cardea right now. But here's a little food for thought, some things about making the ecosystem dynamic, listing approved schemas, following, you know, creating all sorts of various rules for the agents. And then at an advanced level, you can even describe workflow instructions like step 1, go to this party for this information. Step 2, go to this party for this information. Step 3, do some work in your email. When it comes back, do this. There's some advanced workflows and parallel paths that can be described that are at the bottom here. So
this could be a really powerful part for multiple areas, but one of the places that it stands out to me is, for instance, when the lab is looking to release medical data, what are the minimum requirements that are needed to actually release that information? That is a really good place that this could be codified in that workflow to ensure the privacy and security from a governance perspective. So
that whole topic is on our future roadmap for discussion. It's the identity proofing, basically, that's required for medical release. And I think that'll go on another one of Keela's discussion weeks to talk about, because that's a critical issue for the medical people to know when it's appropriate to release the medical data and to whom they should be releasing it.
So yeah, to wrap up, we're committed to putting in some basic governance into Cardea, and we have the sample file here and a small roadmap. And then once that foundation is in place, we'll work as a community to say what's the most important following steps. And that's what we've got for the machine readable governance presentation so far.
one more question. You guys brought up these kinds of rules for the holder. When the holder checks these rules, can it check for any information that's like meta information, the credential that's not just in the proof request? Is there any kind of meta information that's embedded as part of this? For example, like age of credential. I don't think that is currently, I know that's in W3C style credentials. I don't think that's in Indy style credentials. Would the holder be able to check for that information using a governance framework?
So the rules could refer to some of that meta information, and the schemas, you know, in particular the age of the schema, the schema should, or the age of the credential, the schema should include a field for that. James, did you have something too?
Yeah, I think you had a good answer there. I think one of the things that we've done so far is the part of the schema itself contains attributes for in relation to the actual records in use. So this is when this test was taken. This is when it was issued. We've even done, and so that is information that can be used from the schema itself, which is a mechanism to get around the not being able to get the date from when that was issued, or in cases where the record, for instance, that is information we want to issue in a credential.
Yeah, last week we talked about schemas, and one of the things that I think is the biggest takeaway is to make sure that you have a robust enough schema to support all of those metadata tags that you might be interested in, especially as we're working in something that's evolving as quickly as COVID and vaccines, and our understanding is to make sure that there is a schema that has that all of those things that you think you might want, because then you'll have the flexibility in the governance to add that as a rule as the science and sort of global knowledge changes on the subject. So we'll probably talk about schemas again, Dev, and I think it's a really important topic for us to nail down, one that is dynamic enough to cover those use cases, but also reasonable about what to expect in the data.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before we move on to our next speaker?
I think Steve had another question on would it be good to include a connection to existing third-party trust frameworks and certifications like ISO, etc. And I'm not sure if I necessarily have the best answer here. I would say yes. I'm not exactly sure what format that should take. One of my first immediate thoughts is the ARIES interop profiles. So for instance, we've been working against the AIP 1.0, but 2.0 just was ratified a little bit ago, and I think that would be something good to also target. I'm not sure if that belongs at the machine readable layer or if that belongs at a higher governance layer. I would like to hear other people's thoughts on that.
And it may come up as we go through with Lucy and Sam both coming up next. Any other questions before we shift a little? Okay, so Lucy is going to talk about global COVID certificate network and how that sort of coexists and how it fits into this discussion. So Lucy, your floor is yours.
Thanks, Keela, and thanks the Cardea community give me an opportunity to talk about the new project that was launched this week by Linux Foundation Public Health. So before I start, let me share first like the relevant kind of links and news so folks know what I'm talking about. So this is the press release and also the doc that we have here. So first of all, for those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm the community director of the COVID Credentials Initiative, and we are part of Linux Foundation Public Health. It's like kind of like a COVID credential community, and we're COVID credential kind of arm of Linux of LPH. So my role with CCI and also with LPH has been a lot of my work focused on speaking to governments, and which is kind of a mandate, a part of the mandate of VH is supporting governments and public health authorities to combat COVID as a starting point, and the broader mandate is supporting public health in general, like through open source and technology. So in the past few months, we have been, while we're doing the work in the COVID credentials initiative work on standardization and also supporting LPH in terms of identifying the open source projects and supporting some of the projects like Cardea and the other project Macrats, we're hoping that the kind of, by keep communicating with the potential end users, right, the people we're supporting, to get an idea of what the community needs to build, what it needs to produce to support their work. I think that's how, like, to answer Keela, your question, right? Why I'm speaking here, to hopefully to provide some kind of insights of what we've heard from speaking with governments and also industries, and some of the work we're doing, how kind of like the new Linux Foundation Public Health Project can kind of work with Cardea community on helping solve some of the needs and public health needs. So there are two things we have been hearing in the past few months. One thing is, there's like challenges for countries to make decision to launch a COVID certificate system for cross-border reopening border use cases, because it's hard for them to know a certificate coming from another country, right? They don't know who is the trusted issuer, who they should trust. So that's one of like the thing that keep kind of occurring in our conversations with governments. Another thing is there's so many systems out there, right? What they should use, and what are readily implementable, and also what are built on the good, on good technology practice and good principles. So that's like the two things we keep hearing, and the reason why we're launching this initiative now is because I think some of you have been participating in the Good Health Path Collaborative, which I think in the past 2 months, right, like they very, very productively produced the interoperable Good Health Path interoperability blueprint, which actually has a focus on like reopening and international travel. There's a lot of like kind of issues like they're trying to address through the blueprint, which is also something like LPH we're hoping to resolve. And also, as many of you may know, we have been kind of co-leading our CCI's ecosystem director, Cardea, has been co-leading the drafting groups at the interoperability working group, hosted by Trust Our IP Foundation, but there's a lot of organizations involved, which is a good thing, which means there are a lot of like support and behind it. So the draft of the blueprint was published this week for public review. So we were like, this is a great opportunity for Linux Foundation Public Health to see how we can leverage the recommendations, right, and turn that into technical specs and also implementation, reference implementations for our government, the folks who are serving, and not only government but also industries, whoever are working at the forefront to solve this public health issues, and especially on reopening borders, how we can leverage that to leverage the blueprint to help them. So that's why we launched the Linux Foundation, the new project called the Global COVID Certificate Network. And also another kind of very important context here is what we also keep hearing people like referring to is the EU digital COVID certificate, right? And I think the two key problems, right, we heard from just in general from our stakeholders are the trust framework, right, the trust mechanism, and also the actual readily implementable systems. Both are provided as part of the EU kind of a digital COVID certificate. It's just in a different way as our community has been approaching. But we also understand there's EU for the EU, right? It can be the central authority can do a centralized public key infrastructure, which probably won't be the case for the rest of the world. But at the same time, like the Good Health Path interoperability blueprint offer us kind of a framework how to approach it in a decentralized way. So that's the reason why one of like the key components of the Global COVID Certificate Network, GCCN, is how we can help countries and jurisdictions, where also industry, large industry alliances who are tackling the cross-border issues to help them, connect their trust registries in a way that, it's starting very simple. We were hoping to create a directory of trust registries so that it's easier for countries and jurisdictions, whoever is setting up the ecosystem, right, for cross-border border reopening use cases can actually, it's easier to discover the list of trusted issuers, and we're even like verifiers and the governance rules of another country, so they can decide, can I accept a certificate from another jurisdiction? So that's kind of one of the key components that we're offering, and through like GCCN. Another important thing is how we can provide readily implemented tools like for issuing, storing and verify credentials or certificates, whatever is the best term here. And that's the reason why another key part of GCCN is to have that complete toolkit provided, not necessarily all through Linux Foundation Public Health, but we're hoping to collaborate with like Trust over IP Foundation, probably other communities, and by developing those technical specs and tools, and so that there's a complete suite of like reference implementations, right, that governments or industries can take. And that's where we see how we're hoping that I do hear a lot of kind of like alignments like between the work Cardea community is working on and the kind of like the tools we're looking at. So we're hopefully we can keep exploring down that path, and how this Cardea community, like what the community is producing, can be leveraged for GCCN. So I think that's the kind of high level context here, and I'm going to stop here and see if any questions.
I have a question for you, Lucy. So it sounds like you're describing two different things: a way to publicize the rules for a country or a government to make a well-known point where they can come pick up those rules. And the second is to foster and support implementation tools such as Cardea's effort to try to make those implementation tools available to governments or other organizations who want to participate, so that they can have a sample of how to implement and interact with those rules. On the rules, you mentioned knowing who trusted issuers are. Is the organization, the Global COVID Certificate Network, are they the root of trust? They're saying who's a trusted issuer, or is it the government who says, here's who I trust? Or do you have a...
Great question. So we're very much aware that we're not EU, so we can't tell governments, right, what you need to do. So the idea is to have that kind of decentralized and kind of flexible way that each jurisdiction, whoever is setting up the ecosystem, they should have their own governance framework and defining, right, who are the trusted issuers. And so we're just pretty much providing what is the analogy? It's pretty much a discovery kind of like mechanism, right? It's so that you have a list of the ecosystems and pointers, right, to the governance and to the list of trusted issuers that other countries, jurisdictions can look at and then make decisions of when they're setting up their rules, right? Are we going to accept a certificate from this country, knowing that who they allow to issue credentials?
So you're more or less trying to provide a mechanism to facilitate discovery, because you're not making the rules. What you're trying to do is say, here's, if you're going to country XYZ, here's where you might find their rules, so that they can facilitate the discovery and then pick up those rules from the trusted sources. Or are you going to have copies of the rules local in a directory, or are you only pointing references out to the rules?
I feel like I don't have a definite answer for this now. That's something we're hoping to speak with the government, right? The idea is we're having this network, and we're speaking with some of the EU institutions and also some of the governments we're working with. We're hoping to put them into conversation. So pretty much what happened in the EU is they have an e-health network where the member states actually assign their team to actually talk and discover what is the best mechanism. So we're hoping to put that, it's pretty much put a flag in the ground, so like our stakeholders can come together and have that discussion, and that's where they can. So I think we're going to have a lightweight some governance for that directory, just more how we how jurisdictions can participate in the conversation, but won't be like, how the rules, how they need to make the rules. Hopefully they can reach some kind of consensus, which can provide a better, more kind of comprehensive template for other countries to participate or jurisdictions to participate in this network. So that's the.
Thanks, Lucy. Does anybody have questions for Lucy before we move on? Lucy, I suspect you will speak in the future sessions here, so I'm sure we'll hear from you again soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We will provide more details as we have this conversation. So hopefully, more to share in the coming weeks. Thanks.
Lucy,
Absolutely.
where do people go to participate in your conversations? Is it all held under the auspices of Lennox Foundation Good Health? Or is it under Good Health Pass? Where is the conversation about what the network, the Global COVID Certificate Network, where is that conversation held?
Great question. So now that we actually have two streams of conversations, right? In one stream is mainly done like by Lennox Foundation Public Health staff, which is communicating with our government contacts and also industry contacts and getting their input. Another kind of stream conversations with the community, right? Like the CCI community, and also the Good Health Pass community, and also Trust over IP Foundation community, whichever community who are interested in coming together to develop that toolkit for government. So that conversation where John is here, and John and Cardea are we're kind of organizing, making the next steps. So we should be able to have like more kind of like details to share with you guys and how you can participate in these conversations. And at the same time, with the conversation with government, our team will keep updating the community, right? What are the needs? What are the requirements? What are the asks?
Thank you.
All right, Sam, sorry to give you just a couple of minutes here, but it's been such a great discussion today.
It's been fantastic. So what I want to do is I want to talk about how machine readable governance sort of fits in. This is a slide I stole from the Good Health Pass interoperability blueprint visual reference. I may have got the title slightly wrong. And so this describes kind of what they have. And I have a modified one here that I'll flip back and forth for a second. You can know the biggest change here is that there are rules engines that operate, I believe, like services. I do not, I am not the expert on this, but in conversations, this is what I've been able to understand so far. The rules engines act like services in that they are queried, and they can be queried by the holder as well as the issuer and the verifier. And I have questions about this, but the basic idea here is here's what changes. The governing authority uses a trust registry, and I didn't get the lines perfect here, but the idea is that the governing authority publishes a machine readable governance framework that then can be downloaded and held and evaluated locally by all the parties, issuer, holder, and verifier here, in order to see how that actually works. And so there are similar goals in figuring out who's trusted, what's trusted, and everything else, but the mechanisms are subtly different. I'm not making a case that rules engines should not exist. I'm making the case that there's an architecture here that has some significant advantages in the machine readable governance frameworks. Does anyone I have some comparison real quick. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?
Sam, so there's nothing that would prevent a rules engine from downloading that same machine readable governance framework and loading it in and having it operate the way it did in diagram 1, or
that's totally true. It's also possible that you could have both machine readable governance frameworks and rules engines that actively operate, and you might have an issuer that consults both a machine readable governance framework and a rules engine depending on the use cases and the needs going on. So they answer similar questions but in a different way. And here's some examples. One of the things that rules engines do is they actually can mask both some complexity and unpublished rules. If you are evaluating credentials presented against non-credential data, like some other data source that you have, then a rules engine that has access to that data source could be the answer there. The easiest or most common example I could come up with for this was a no-fly list. They don't publish the no-fly list that governments maintain, but they'll check to see if someone is on it. That's data that is not in the credential itself, and a rules engine could play a role to help the verifier doing that. The verifier may just also check that list themselves, but there's some good cases where moving the complexity away into a separate service might make sense. It does carry a higher service cost, and it's got to be highly available if this is something that you query at the time of verification. Machine readable governance frameworks have an additional advantage of being offline capable. If you're exchanging a credential in an offline manner and you don't have access to the network itself, but you do have sufficiently cached information, which is facilitated by the machine readable governance framework, then you can actually evaluate presented credentials against that in an offline manner, and that's really nice. There's nothing more scalable than something that has no service to call live. That's a nice advantage. Here's some comparisons just real quick to see how they fit in. The main point, to get back to the question earlier, is that how does the trust registry actually play a role here? And the answer is it still exists, but is involved in the publishing of the machine readable governance framework. It's not something that actually needs to be queried in a live manner, but it still exists in order to track all the right information. And I see the machine readable governance framework, when appropriate, as the publishing of that information into the standard format so that it can be used by the various pieces of software in the ecosystem. So we're up against the wall here. I talked fast.
Yes, that you did excellent. Steve had a question earlier. So Steve, did we answer your question from earlier about trust networks?
No.
Registries.
Yeah. So I mean, I get the concept of the registry. I actually worked on some of these diagrams. I get the concept of machine readable governance framework. What I'm unclear about is how you foresee those two things overlapping.
I see the machine readable governance framework as a serialization of the data in the trust registry.
Ooh, we should have some conversations then. Thanks.
We should. If there's stuff that I don't understand that doesn't align there about the trust registry, then it's possible that I'm misunderstanding what the trust registry actually is.
Okay, and I think the other point also from Steve was that rules engines can be applied on the before issuing, and I think that came up sort of subtly earlier in this discussion, which is that you can check on things before, right? Whether or not it's safe to issue, for example, on identity, then you can use rules engines to check the identity before you've issued the credential. So absolutely, that's a good point. All right, any other questions? I think today's discussion was excellent.
Sam, Richardson asked if you can post a link for that slide. Would that be something we could add to the notes potentially?
Yeah, I have no problem doing so. It's not beautiful and probably has errors, but you're welcome to all of it in all of its glory.
I did snap one, but if you send that, Sam, or if you just want to include it in the notes, that would be excellent.
I will share a link momentarily.
Next week, we'll be talking about part 2 of the Holder app. We should have a little bit more in-depth conversation about that. We made it through about 2/3 of the stack all the way to the top. We hope to get all the way to the top and have that available for public review.
All right, thanks everybody. Looking forward to next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks.